Picture this. It's 2:47 a.m. on December 12, 2016, in Havana, Cuba. And CIA operative Sarah Chen is lying in her secure apartment when she suddenly hears this piercing, high-pitched sound that feels like it's drilling straight into her skull. Within seconds, her vision starts blurring. Her head feels like it's being crushed in a vise, and she's vomiting uncontrollably on her bedroom floor. When she manages to crawl to her window and look outside, she sees a white van parked across the street that wasn't there when she went to bed. And as soon as she spots it, the van speeds away and the torture stops. The next morning, Sarah discovers that her brain has been permanently damaged by something that shouldn't exist, according to everything we know about physics in warfare. This is the story of Havana Syndrome, the most terrifying invisible war that's been waged against American intelligence personnel. And what I'm about to tell you is so insane that you're gonna think I'm making it up. But this is all real, it's all documented, and it's still happening right now as we speak. Over 300 American diplomats, CIA operatives, FBI agents, and military personnel have been attacked by an unknown enemy using weapons that we can't identify, can't defend against, and can't even fully understand. The attacks are causing permanent brain damage, and our government has spent 7 years trying to figure out who's doing this and how to stop them, with zero success. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare, because understanding how this all started is crucial to grasping just how sophisticated and terrifying this invisible enemy really is. It was November 2016, just a few weeks after Donald Trump had been elected president, but before he'd taken office, and the American embassy in Havana, Cuba was operating under some of the most complex diplomatic circumstances imaginable. The Obama administration had just begun normalizing relations with Cuba after decades of Cold War hostility, which meant American intelligence operations in Havana were incredibly sensitive and closely monitored by both Cuban and Russian intelligence services. The American embassy compound in Havana sits on the Malecón, the famous seaside drive that curves along Havana Bay, in a massive Art Deco building that was constructed in the 1950s when Cuba was still firmly in the American sphere of influence. The building itself is like something out of a spy movie, 7 stories of limestone and glass with bulletproof windows, sophisticated electronic countermeasures, and security systems that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. The embassy houses not just diplomatic personnel but also CIA operatives working under diplomatic cover, military attachés, gathering intelligence on Cuban and Russian activities, and FBI agents monitoring everything from drug trafficking to terrorist threats. Agent Sarah Chen was one of these CIA operatives, a 15-year veteran of the intelligence community who specialized in human intelligence operations in hostile environments. Sarah had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and several other locations where American intelligence officers were actively hunted by enemy forces, but she'd never experienced anything like what was about to happen to her in supposedly peaceful Cuba. Sarah's apartment was located in a residential building about 8 blocks from the embassy, in the Vedado neighborhood that housed most of the American diplomatic personnel working in Havana. The building was owned by a front company controlled by the CIA, and every apartment was equipped with sophisticated surveillance detection equipment, secure communications gear, and countermeasures designed to prevent foreign intelligence services from eavesdropping on American operations. On the evening of December 11, 2016, Sarah had spent the day conducting what the CIA calls a developmental meeting with a Cuban government official who had been providing information about Russian military advisors operating in Cuba. The meeting had taken place at a restaurant in Old Havana, and Sarah had followed standard protocols for operational security, multiple route changes, surveillance detection procedures, and electronic countermeasures to ensure she wasn't being followed or monitored by Cuban intelligence. Sarah returned to her apartment around 10:30 p.m., conducted her standard security sweep of the premises, and sent an encrypted message to CIA headquarters in Langley reporting that the meeting had been successful, and that her Cuban contact had provided valuable intelligence about Russian activities. Everything seemed normal, and Sarah went to bed around midnight, feeling confident that her operational security had been maintained. At 2:47 a.m., Sarah woke up to the most terrifying experience of her life. She later described it to CIA medical personnel as starting with a sound that seemed to be coming from inside her own head, a high-pitched, piercing tone that felt like someone was driving a drill bit directly into her brain. The sound was so intense and disorienting that Sarah couldn't immediately determine whether it was coming from outside her apartment or from some kind of internal medical emergency. Within seconds of the sound beginning, Sarah started experiencing symptoms that no CIA training had prepared her for. Her vision became blurry and distorted, like she was looking through water or thick glass. Her balance completely disappeared, making it impossible to stand upright without falling over. Nausea hit her like a freight train, and she started vomiting uncontrollably, while also experiencing vertigo so severe that she couldn't tell which direction was up or down. But the most terrifying part was what was happening to her cognitive abilities. Sarah later told investigators that she could feel her mind shutting down in real time, like someone was systematically disconnecting different parts of her brain. She couldn't form coherent thoughts, couldn't remember where she was or what she was supposed to be doing, and couldn't access basic information that should have been automatic, like her own name or how to operate simple devices like door handles or light switches. Sarah managed to crawl to her bedroom window, a journey that normally would have taken 5 seconds but now required several minutes because of her complete loss of motor control. When she pulled herself up to look outside, she saw a white panel van parked directly across the street from her building, positioned so that it had a clear line of sight to her 5th-floor apartment. The van hadn't been there when Sarah went to bed, and something about its positioning and the way it was angled toward her building immediately triggered her operational instincts. The moment Sarah spotted the van, she heard the driver start the engine, and watched as the vehicle accelerated away from the scene, tires squealing as it disappeared around the corner. And here's the truly bizarre part. The instant the van drove away, all of Sarah's symptoms stopped. The piercing sound cut off like someone had flipped a switch. Her vision cleared, the nausea disappeared, and her cognitive abilities returned to normal. Sarah immediately contacted the CIA station chief in Havana, a veteran intelligence officer named Michael Rodriguez, who had been running operations in Latin America for over 20 years. Rodriguez had Sarah transported to a secure medical facility within the embassy compound, where she was examined by a doctor who had top-secret clearance and experience treating intelligence personnel who had been exposed to various forms of attack. The initial medical examination found nothing obviously wrong with Sarah's health. Her vital signs were normal. Her neurological reflexes appeared to be functioning properly, and she didn't show any obvious signs of poisoning, chemical exposure, or physical trauma. But Sarah insisted that something had definitely happened to her, and her detailed description of the symptoms and the suspicious van convinced Rodriguez that this wasn't a medical emergency or psychological episode. Rodriguez immediately initiated what the CIA calls a hostile action investigation, treating Sarah's experience as a potential attack by foreign intelligence services. The investigation team included counterintelligence specialists, electronic warfare experts, and medical personnel who had experience with unconventional weapons and attack methods. But before the investigation could make any real progress, the attacks started happening to other American personnel. On December 15th, 3 days after Sarah's experience, FBI agent Marcus Williams was attacked in his apartment just 4 blocks from Sarah's building. Marcus was a 12-year veteran of the FBI who specialized in counterintelligence operations and was working under diplomatic cover to investigate Russian intelligence activities in Cuba. His experience was nearly identical to Sarah's, a piercing sound that seemed to come from inside his head, followed by severe neurological symptoms that lasted until he spotted a suspicious vehicle outside his building. 2 days later, on December 17th, State Department diplomat Jennifer Walsh was attacked while working late in her office on the third floor of the embassy building itself. Jennifer was a political officer who had been monitoring Cuban government activities and reporting on potential policy changes that might affect American interests. Her attack happened around 11:30 p.m., when she was alone in her office finishing a classified report about Cuban-Russian military cooperation. Jennifer's experience was particularly terrifying because it demonstrated that the attackers could penetrate even the most secure areas of the American embassy compound. The embassy building was supposed to be protected by multiple layers of security, including electronic countermeasures specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of attack that Jennifer experienced. Jennifer later told investigators that she first noticed something was wrong when her computer screen started flickering and displaying strange patterns that didn't correspond to any software she was running. She initially thought it might be some kind of cyber attack or electronic malfunction, but then she started hearing the same high-pitched sound that Sarah and Marcus had described. The symptoms that followed were identical to what the other victims had experienced: severe headache, vision problems, loss of balance, nausea, and cognitive impairment that felt like her brain was shutting down piece by piece. But Jennifer's attack lasted longer than the others, continuing for nearly 15 minutes before suddenly stopping when embassy security guards conducted their routine patrol of the building's perimeter. By December 20th, 2016, 8 American personnel had been attacked, and the CIA station chief Michael Rodriguez was facing the most serious security crisis of his career. The attacks were clearly targeted at American intelligence and diplomatic personnel. They were using some kind of technology that the Americans couldn't identify or defend against. And they were causing real medical damage to highly trained professionals who were critical to U.S. operations in Cuba. Rodriguez sent an emergency cable to CIA headquarters, describing the attacks and requesting immediate assistance from the agency's most advanced technical and medical specialists. The cable was classified at the highest levels and was personally reviewed by CIA Director John Brennan, who immediately recognized that the agency was facing a completely new type of threat. Within 48 hours, a specialized CIA response team was deployed to Havana, including electronic warfare specialists from the agency's Directorate of Science and Technology, counterintelligence officers from the Counterproliferation Center, and medical personnel from the agency's Office of Medical Services, who had experience with unconventional weapons and attack methods. Dr. Amanda Foster was one of the medical specialists sent to investigate the attacks. Dr. Foster had spent 15 years studying the effects of directed energy weapons, electromagnetic pulse devices, and other exotic technologies that might be used by foreign intelligence services to attack American personnel. She had worked on classified projects involving everything from microwave weapons to sonic devices, and she had access to medical information about similar attacks that had occurred in other locations around the world. Dr. Foster's initial assessment of the Havana victims was deeply troubling. While the victims appeared to be physically healthy during routine medical examinations, more sophisticated testing revealed subtle but significant neurological damage that was consistent with exposure to some kind of directed energy weapon. Brain scans using advanced MRI technology showed structural changes in the victims' brains, particularly in areas responsible for cognitive function, balance, and sensory processing. The damage wasn't severe enough to cause permanent disability, but it was definitely real and measurable, and it was unlike anything Dr. Foster had seen before. "These aren't psychological symptoms," Dr. Foster told the CIA team. "We're looking at actual physical damage to brain tissue, caused by some kind of external energy source that we haven't identified yet." The electronic warfare specialists were equally baffled by what they found when they investigated the attack sites. Using sophisticated detection equipment, they were able to identify unusual electromagnetic signatures in the areas where the attacks had occurred, but the signatures didn't match any known weapons or electronic devices. The electromagnetic readings suggested that the attacks involved some kind of directed energy beam that operated in frequency ranges that were unusual for conventional weapons. The energy signatures were very focused and precise, indicating that the attackers had sophisticated targeting capabilities and were using technology that was more advanced than anything in the American military arsenal. But the most disturbing discovery was that the attackers seemed to have detailed intelligence about American personnel and their daily routines. The attacks were perfectly timed to occur when the victims were alone and vulnerable, and the locations were chosen to maximize the effectiveness of whatever technology was being used. Sarah Chen's apartment had been targeted when she was sleeping in a specific bedroom that faced the street, making it easy for an external energy beam to reach her through the window. Marcus Williams had been attacked when he was in his living room, which had large windows that provided a clear line of sight from the street. Jennifer Walsh had been targeted when she was working alone in an office that was positioned on the corner of the embassy building, with windows facing two different directions. This level of operational planning and intelligence suggested that the attacks were being carried out by a sophisticated intelligence service with extensive knowledge of American personnel and facilities in Havana. The CIA investigators concluded that they were dealing with either Cuban intelligence services working with advanced Russian technology, or Russian intelligence services operating directly in Cuba with the knowledge and cooperation of the Cuban government. By January 2017, the attacks had increased in frequency and sophistication. American personnel were being targeted not just in their homes and offices, but also in restaurants, hotels, and other public locations throughout Havana. The attackers seemed to have developed portable versions of their weapons that could be deployed from vehicles or even carried by individuals on foot. CIA operative David Kim was attacked while having dinner at a restaurant in Old Havana. On January 8, 2017, David was meeting with a Cuban contact who had been providing information about Russian military advisors, and the meeting was taking place in a crowded restaurant that should have provided security through anonymity. David's attack began while he was sitting at a table near the restaurant's front window, engaged in what appeared to be a casual conversation with his Cuban contact. The attack started with the same high-pitched sound that other victims had described, but this time it was accompanied by a sensation that David later described as feeling like his brain was being cooked from the inside. The symptoms were so severe that David collapsed at the table, frightening other restaurant patrons and creating a scene that could have compromised his operational cover. His Cuban contact helped him outside, where David spotted a man standing across the street holding what looked like a small electronic device pointed directly at the restaurant. When David made eye contact with the man, the individual immediately walked away and disappeared into the crowded streets of Old Havana. The attack stopped as soon as the man left, but David was left with symptoms that lasted for several hours and required medical treatment at the embassy. The fact that the attacks were now happening in public locations with innocent bystanders present suggested that the attackers were becoming more aggressive and less concerned about operational security. It also indicated that they had developed weapons that were portable and could be deployed quickly without requiring elaborate setup or positioning. FBI agent Lisa Rodriguez was attacked on January 12 while staying at the Hotel Nacional, one of Havana's most famous luxury hotels that housed many foreign diplomats and journalists. Lisa was in Cuba as part of a joint FBI-CIA operation to investigate Russian intelligence activities, and she was staying at the hotel under diplomatic cover as a cultural attaché. Lisa's attack occurred at 3:30 a.m. while she was sleeping in her room on the 8th floor of the hotel. The attack followed the same pattern as the others: piercing sound, severe neurological symptoms, and complete incapacitation lasting until the attackers withdrew from the area. But Lisa's experience provided crucial intelligence about the attackers' capabilities. Her room faced inland rather than toward the street, and the hotel was surrounded by other tall buildings that would have made it difficult to target her room from ground level. This suggested that the attackers were using either aircraft-mounted weapons or devices that could be operated from other buildings in the area. Lisa also reported that during her attack, she heard what sounded like a small aircraft or drone flying near her window, though she couldn't see anything when she managed to look outside. This was the first indication that the attacks might involve aerial platforms rather than ground-based weapons. By February 2017, 24 American personnel had been attacked, and the CIA was facing pressure from the highest levels of the US government to identify the attackers and develop defensive measures. The attacks were causing serious diplomatic complications with the Cuban government, which was denying any knowledge of the incidents and suggesting that they might be caused by some kind of mass psychological phenomenon rather than deliberate attacks. The Cuban government's response was particularly frustrating for American investigators because it was impossible to determine whether the Cubans were genuinely unaware of the attacks or whether they were providing cover for Russian operations. Cuba had a long history of hosting Russian intelligence operations, and the timing of the attacks coincided with increased Russian military activity throughout Latin America. CIA Director John Brennan personally briefed President Obama about the Havana attacks in February 2017, describing them as a new form of warfare that posed unprecedented challenges for American intelligence operations. Brennan told the president that the attacks represented a fundamental shift in the nature of espionage and counterintelligence operations, and warned that similar attacks could potentially be launched against American personnel anywhere in the world. President Obama authorized a massive increase in resources for investigating the attacks, including the deployment of the CIA's most advanced technical specialists and the allocation of funding for developing defensive countermeasures. The president also directed the State Department to lodge formal protests with both the Cuban and Russian governments, demanding explanations for the attacks and threatening diplomatic consequences if they continued. But the attacks did continue, and they started spreading beyond Cuba to other locations where American intelligence personnel were operating. In March 2017, similar attacks began occurring in China, targeting American diplomats and intelligence officers working at the U.S. consulate in Guangzhou. The first attack in China occurred on March 15, 2017, when State Department diplomat Robert Chen was targeted while working in his office at the American consulate in Guangzhou. Robert's experience was nearly identical to what had been happening in Cuba: piercing sound, severe neurological symptoms, and complete incapacitation lasting until the attackers withdrew. The fact that similar attacks were now occurring in China suggested that either multiple foreign intelligence services had developed the same technology independently, or that one intelligence service was conducting operations in multiple countries. Given the sophisticated nature of the weapons and the level of operational planning required, CIA analysts concluded that they were probably dealing with Russian intelligence services operating with the cooperation of both Cuban and Chinese authorities. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been studying the Cuba attacks, was immediately deployed to China to examine the Guangzhou victims and determine whether they had been attacked with the same weapons. Her analysis confirmed that the neurological damage patterns were identical to what she had observed in Cuba, indicating that the same technology was being used in both locations. The expansion of the attacks to China was particularly concerning because it suggested that the attackers were targeting American intelligence operations on a global scale rather than focusing on a specific regional conflict. This indicated a level of strategic planning and resource allocation that was consistent with a major intelligence service conducting a sustained campaign against American interests. By April 2017, the attacks had affected over 40 American personnel in Cuba and China, and intelligence agencies around the world were beginning to report similar incidents involving their own personnel. British intelligence officers working in Russia reported experiencing similar symptoms, and German diplomats in Beijing described attacks that matched the pattern of what was happening to American personnel. The international scope of the attacks suggested that the phenomenon was much larger than initially believed, and that American personnel were just one target in a broader campaign of what intelligence analysts were beginning to call cognitive warfare. Attacks designed to damage the mental capabilities of intelligence professionals rather than killing them outright. CIA counterintelligence specialist Maria Santos was tasked with analyzing the global pattern of attacks, and developing a comprehensive assessment of the threat. Maria had spent 12 years studying Russian intelligence operations and was considered one of the agency's leading experts on Moscow's unconventional warfare capabilities. Maria's analysis concluded that the attacks represented a new form of intelligence warfare that was designed to degrade American intelligence capabilities without triggering a conventional military response. By causing brain damage to American intelligence officers, the attackers could reduce the effectiveness of U.S. operations while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. This is asymmetric warfare at its most sophisticated, Maria reported to CIA headquarters. The attackers are using technology that we can't identify to cause medical damage that we can't treat, targeting personnel who are critical to our national security operations. And they're doing it in a way that makes it almost impossible to prove who's responsible or to justify a military response. The psychological impact of the attacks was almost as damaging as the physical effects. American intelligence personnel working in high-threat environments were already under enormous stress, and the knowledge that they could be attacked at any time by invisible weapons was creating additional anxiety and paranoia that was affecting their operational effectiveness. Sarah Chen, the CIA operative who had been one of the first victims in Cuba, was medically evacuated to the United States in May 2017 after experiencing ongoing neurological problems that made it impossible for her to continue intelligence work. Sarah's medical evaluation at Walter Reed Medical Center confirmed that she had suffered permanent brain damage that was affecting her memory, concentration, and motor coordination. "I've been shot at, bombed, and poisoned during my career," Sarah told her CIA debriefers. "But this is different. This feels like someone reached inside my head and rearranged my brain. I can't think the way I used to. And I can't trust my own cognitive abilities anymore." Sarah's case became a turning point in how the CIA approached the attacks, because it demonstrated that the neurological damage was permanent and career-ending for intelligence professionals. The attacks weren't just temporary incapacitation. They were deliberately designed to destroy the cognitive abilities that made intelligence officers effective. Dr. Foster's continued medical research revealed that the attacks were causing damage to specific areas of the brain that were responsible for executive function, spatial reasoning, and information processing, exactly the cognitive skills that were most important for intelligence work. The precision of the damage suggested that the attackers understood neuroscience well enough to target the brain functions that would be most damaging to intelligence professionals. By June 2017, the CIA had quietly withdrawn most of its personnel from Cuba and significantly reduced operations in China, essentially allowing the attackers to achieve their strategic objective of degrading American intelligence capabilities in both countries. The attacks had succeeded in making it too dangerous for American intelligence officers to operate effectively in locations where they were needed most. The withdrawal from Cuba was particularly significant because it represented the first time in CIA history that the agency had been forced to abandon operations in a country due to attacks on personnel using unknown weapons. The precedent was deeply troubling for American intelligence leaders, who realized that similar attacks could potentially be used to force the CIA out of any country where hostile intelligence services had access to the technology. President Trump, who had taken office in January 2017, was briefed about the attacks in June and immediately authorized a massive increase in funding for research into defensive countermeasures and offensive capabilities to retaliate against the attackers. The president also directed the Pentagon to begin developing similar weapons for potential use against enemy intelligence personnel. But developing effective countermeasures proved to be extremely difficult because the CIA still couldn't identify the specific technology being used in the attacks. The electronic signatures suggested some kind of directed energy weapon, but the frequency ranges and power levels didn't match any known device in any country's military arsenal. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, was tasked with developing both defensive and offensive directed energy weapons based on the limited technical intelligence that had been gathered from the attack sites. DARPA scientists worked with classified information about the electromagnetic signatures and neurological effects to reverse engineer the attack methodology and develop potential countermeasures. Dr. James Richardson, a DARPA scientist who specialized in electromagnetic weapons research, spent 6 months analyzing the technical data from the attacks and concluded that the weapons represented a significant advance in directed energy technology that was probably several years ahead of anything in the American military arsenal. Based on the electromagnetic signatures and the precision of the neurological effects, we're looking at weapons that can focus energy beams with millimeter-level accuracy over distances of several hundred meters, Dr. Richardson reported to Pentagon leadership. This level of precision and control suggests access to advanced material science and signal processing capabilities that we don't currently possess. The implication was that either Russian or Chinese scientists had achieved breakthroughs in directed energy weapons that had given them a significant technological advantage over American researchers, or that they had developed these weapons with assistance from scientists who had previously worked on similar projects in other countries. Meanwhile, the attacks continued to spread to new locations around the world. In August 2017, American diplomats working in Vienna, Austria, began reporting symptoms that matched the pattern of the Cuba and China attacks. The Vienna incidents were particularly concerning because Austria was supposed to be a neutral country, where American personnel could operate with relative safety. The first Vienna attack occurred on August 22, 2017, when CIA operative Jennifer Park was targeted while attending a diplomatic reception at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Jennifer was working under diplomatic cover as a political attaché, but her real mission was to monitor Russian intelligence activities in Central Europe. Jennifer's attack happened while she was talking to Austrian government officials in a crowded reception hall, surrounded by dozens of other diplomats and government officials. The attack began with the familiar piercing sound, followed by severe neurological symptoms that forced Jennifer to excuse herself from the reception and seek medical attention at the American embassy. The fact that the attack occurred in such a public setting, with Austrian government officials present, suggested that the attackers were becoming increasingly bold and were confident that they could operate with impunity, even in supposedly secure diplomatic environments. Austrian authorities were notified about the attack and conducted their own investigation, but they found no evidence of any unusual electronic activity or suspicious individuals in the area during the time of the incident. The lack of any detectable evidence frustrated both American and Austrian investigators, and reinforced the conclusion that the attackers were using extremely sophisticated technology that was difficult to detect with conventional equipment. By September 2017, similar attacks had been reported in Berlin, Germany, Moscow, Russia, and several other European capitals where American intelligence personnel were operating. The global scope of the attacks was creating a crisis for American intelligence operations worldwide, as personnel were reluctant to accept assignments in locations where they might be targeted by invisible weapons. The attacks were also creating diplomatic complications with allied governments, who were concerned about hosting American personnel who might be targeted for attacks that could potentially affect their own citizens. Several European countries began quietly requesting that the United States reduce its intelligence presence to minimize the risk of attacks occurring on their territory. The State Department was forced to issue new guidelines for American diplomatic personnel working overseas, including enhanced medical insurance coverage for neurological injuries and protocols for reporting potential directed energy attacks. The guidelines represented an acknowledgement that the attacks were a permanent threat that American personnel would have to learn to live with. Dr. Foster, who had been studying the attacks for nearly a year, published a classified medical report in October 2017 that concluded the neurological damage was being caused by focused microwave energy beams that were precisely calibrated to disrupt specific brain functions without causing immediately life-threatening injuries. The attackers have developed weapons that can selectively damage cognitive abilities while leaving basic life functions intact, Dr. Foster reported. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of neuroscience and an intention to cause maximum operational damage with minimal risk of international retaliation. The microwave theory was supported by the electromagnetic signatures that had been detected at attack sites and by the specific pattern of neurological damage that victims were experiencing. Microwave energy could theoretically be focused into precise beams and calibrated to affect specific types of brain tissue, though the technology required would be extremely advanced and expensive to develop. The microwave hypothesis also explained why the attacks were causing heating sensations that victims described as feeling like their brains were being cooked from the inside. Microwave energy works by causing water molecules to vibrate rapidly, generating heat that could damage brain tissue if applied with sufficient intensity and precision. But proving the microwave theory was difficult because the weapons appeared to be designed to avoid detection by conventional electronic monitoring equipment. The attackers were using frequency ranges and power levels that were optimized to cause neurological damage, while minimizing the electromagnetic signatures that could be detected by standard surveillance equipment. In November 2017, the CIA received intelligence from a defector who claimed to have knowledge of a Russian intelligence program that was developing directed energy weapons for use against Western intelligence personnel. The defector, whose identity remains classified, provided technical details about microwave weapons that matched many of the characteristics observed in the Havana syndrome attacks. According to the defector, the Russian weapons program had been operational since 2014 and had been tested against American personnel in several countries before being deployed operationally in Cuba and China. The defector claimed that the weapons were being manufactured by a Russian defense contractor with close ties to the intelligence services and were being deployed by specially trained teams of Russian operatives. The defector's information was considered credible because it included technical details that hadn't been publicly disclosed and operational details that matched the pattern of attacks that had been observed in multiple countries. The intelligence provided the first direct evidence that the attacks were being carried out by Russian intelligence services, rather than being the result of some unknown natural phenomenon or technological accident. But even with intelligence about Russian involvement, the CIA was unable to develop effective countermeasures because the weapons technology was too advanced for American researchers to replicate or defend against. The Russians appeared to have achieved a significant technological breakthrough that had given them a temporary but decisive advantage in the invisible warfare competition. President Trump was briefed about the Russian connection in December 2017 and authorized a range of retaliatory measures, including economic sanctions against Russian officials believed to be involved in the weapons program and the development of American directed energy weapons that could be used against Russian intelligence personnel. But the retaliation efforts were complicated by the need to maintain plausible deniability and avoid escalating the conflict into a more direct confrontation. The attacks were causing real damage to American intelligence capabilities, but they weren't severe enough to justify a military response. And proving Russian involvement was difficult because the attacks were designed to avoid leaving evidence that could be used for attribution. By early 2018, over 100 American personnel had been affected by the attacks, and the CIA was facing the most serious operational crisis in its history. The attacks were making it impossible to conduct effective intelligence operations in several key countries, and they were creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that was affecting morale throughout the intelligence community. The psychological impact was particularly severe for intelligence officers, who had spent their careers operating in dangerous environments where they understood the risks and knew how to protect themselves. The invisible nature of the new weapons made it impossible to take effective protective measures, and the randomness of the attacks created constant anxiety about when and where the next attack might occur. CIA operative Michael Torres, who had been attacked in Vienna in January 2018, described the psychological effects in his debriefing report. "You can't see the weapon, you can't hear it coming, and you can't defend against it. It's like being hunted by ghosts. Every headache makes you wonder if you're being attacked. Every strange sound makes you think someone is targeting you. It's impossible to do your job effectively when you're constantly looking over your shoulder for an enemy you can't see. The attacks were also affecting the families of intelligence personnel, who were reluctant to accept overseas assignments that might put their spouses and children at risk of being targeted by invisible weapons. Several experienced intelligence officers requested transfers to domestic assignments or early retirement rather than risk exposing their families to the unknown threat. Dr. Foster's continued research revealed that the neurological damage from the attacks was cumulative, meaning that personnel who were attacked multiple times suffered progressively more severe cognitive impairment. This discovery led to a policy of immediately evacuating any personnel who had been attacked once, regardless of the apparent severity of their symptoms. The evacuation policy effectively meant that a single attack could end an intelligence officer's overseas career, giving the attackers enormous leverage to disrupt American operations by targeting key personnel. The policy was necessary to protect personnel from permanent disability, but it also meant that the attackers could achieve their strategic objectives with relatively few actual attacks. In March 2018, the attacks began occurring within the United States itself, targeting American intelligence personnel at domestic facilities. The first domestic attack occurred at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, when analyst Rebecca Martinez was targeted while working in her office in the original headquarters building. Rebecca's attack followed the same pattern as the overseas incidents: piercing sounds, severe neurological symptoms, and complete incapacitation lasting until the attackers withdrew. But the fact that the attack occurred within the most secure CIA facility in the world suggested that the attackers had developed weapons that could be deployed from significant distances, or that they had found ways to penetrate American security measures. The Langley attack created panic within the CIA leadership, because it demonstrated that even the agency's most secure facilities weren't safe from the invisible weapons. If attackers could target personnel within CIA headquarters, they could potentially attack any American intelligence facility anywhere in the world. Security measures at CIA facilities were immediately upgraded to include electromagnetic shielding and directed energy detection equipment. But the effectiveness of these measures was questionable because the agency still didn't fully understand the technology being used in the attacks. The domestic attacks continued throughout 2018. With incidents reported at facilities in Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. The attacks were creating a crisis of confidence within the American intelligence community, as personnel began to question whether their own government could protect them from invisible enemies operating within the United States. By the end of 2018, over 200 American personnel had been affected by the attacks, and the phenomenon had acquired the name Havana syndrome because of the location where it was first identified. The attacks had forced significant changes in American intelligence operations worldwide and had created lasting damage to the careers and health of some of the country's most experienced intelligence professionals. The incoming Biden administration in 2021 inherited a situation where American intelligence personnel were being systematically targeted by unknown attackers using weapons that the U.S. government couldn't identify, defend against, or retaliate against effectively. The new administration immediately prioritized finding solutions to the Havana syndrome crisis and allocated significant resources to both medical treatment for victims and development of countermeasures. Vice President Kamala Harris was personally briefed about the attacks during her first week in office, and made a commitment to affected personnel that the administration would leave no stone unturned in identifying the attackers and developing protective measures. The vice president's involvement brought high-level political attention to the issue and ensured that it would remain a priority for the new administration. Dr. Foster, who had been studying the attacks for over 4 years, was appointed to lead a new interagency task force that included representatives from the CIA, FBI, Pentagon, and National Security Council. The task force was given unprecedented resources and authority to investigate the attacks and develop solutions. The task force's first major breakthrough came in early 2021, when advanced signal processing techniques were used to analyze electromagnetic data from attack sites and identify previously undetected patterns in the energy signatures. The new analysis revealed that the attacks involved multiple frequency bands operating simultaneously, suggesting weapons that were even more sophisticated than previously believed. The multi-frequency approach explained why previous detection efforts had been unsuccessful and why the neurological effects were so precisely targeted. By using multiple frequency bands, the attackers could create interference patterns that focused energy with millimeter-level precision while avoiding detection by conventional monitoring equipment. Dr. Richardson from DARPA used the new technical intelligence to develop prototype countermeasures that could potentially detect and disrupt the attack weapons. The countermeasures involved sophisticated signal processing equipment that could identify the multi-frequency signatures and generate interference patterns to neutralize the incoming energy beams. Field testing of the countermeasures began in summer 2021 at American facilities that had previously been targeted for attacks. The early results were promising, with several potential attacks being detected and apparently disrupted before they could cause neurological damage to personnel. But the attackers adapted quickly to the new defensive measures, modifying their weapons to use different frequency ranges and power levels that could circumvent the American countermeasures. The technological competition between attackers and defenders accelerated rapidly, with both sides developing increasingly sophisticated capabilities. The cat-and-mouse game between American defensive measures and the attackers' evolving weapons continued throughout 2021 and 2022, with neither side achieving a decisive advantage. The attacks became less frequent as American countermeasures improved, but they didn't stop completely, and the attackers demonstrated an ability to modify their tactics and technology to maintain their operational effectiveness. In late 2022, the CIA received intelligence, suggesting that the attack weapons were being manufactured by multiple countries, rather than just Russia, with China, North Korea, and Iran all developing similar capabilities. The proliferation of directed energy weapons technology meant that American intelligence personnel could potentially face attacks from multiple adversaries, using different variations of the same basic weapon system. The intelligence came from multiple sources, including signals intelligence intercepted by the National Security Agency, human intelligence from assets within foreign defense contractors, and technical analysis of weapons fragments recovered from attack sites. The convergent intelligence painted a picture of a rapidly expanding threat that was becoming more sophisticated and more widespread with each passing month. Chinese intelligence services had apparently developed their own version of the weapons after reverse engineering captured Russian equipment, while North Korean and Iranian programs were believed to be based on technology transferred from Russia as part of broader military cooperation agreements. Each country had made modifications to the basic design, resulting in weapons with different signatures and capabilities that required separate countermeasures. The proliferation crisis reached a new level in January 2023, when American personnel began experiencing attacks that were clearly different from the original Havana syndrome incidents. The new attacks caused different types of neurological damage and used frequency ranges that weren't covered by existing countermeasures, suggesting that adversaries had developed second-generation weapons based on lessons learned from American defensive efforts. CIA operative Sarah Chen was one of the first victims of the new weapons system, attacked while working at the American Embassy in Bangkok, Thailand in February 2023. Daniel's experience was similar to earlier attacks in terms of the immediate symptoms, but medical examination revealed that the neurological damage was concentrated in different areas of the brain and followed patterns that hadn't been seen before. Dr. Foster's analysis of Daniel's case concluded that the new weapons were designed to cause damage that would be even more difficult to treat than the original attacks. While the earlier weapons had primarily affected cognitive functions that could potentially be retrained or compensated for, the new weapons appeared to target fundamental neurological processes that were essential for basic motor control and sensory processing. We're looking at weapons that are specifically designed to cause permanent disability rather than just temporary incapacitation, Dr. Foster reported to the task force. The attackers have moved beyond trying to degrade our operational effectiveness and are now trying to destroy our personnel's ability to function in any capacity. The escalation and the severity of the attacks created new urgency for developing effective countermeasures and identifying the attackers so that diplomatic or military pressure could be brought to bear to stop the attacks. The Biden administration authorized a significant expansion of the investigation, including the deployment of technical specialists to every American facility that had experienced attacks and the development of advanced detection systems that could provide early warning of incoming energy beams. The expanded investigation finally achieved a breakthrough in March 2023, when sophisticated new monitoring equipment deployed at the American Embassy in Vienna detected an attack in progress and successfully tracked the energy beam to its source. The tracking data revealed that the attack was being launched from a vehicle parked approximately 400 meters from the embassy, using equipment that was small enough to be concealed within a standard passenger van. Austrian police were immediately notified and intercepted the vehicle before it could escape the area. The vehicle contained sophisticated electronic equipment that matched the theoretical specifications for the weapons that Dr. Richardson's team had developed based on analysis of the attack signatures. More importantly, the vehicle's occupants were carrying Russian diplomatic passports and claimed to be conducting routine embassy business in Vienna. The capture of Russian operatives with the attack equipment provided the first direct proof that the attacks were being carried out by Russian intelligence services, rather than by some unknown group or natural phenomenon. The evidence was strong enough to support formal diplomatic protests and economic sanctions, but the Russians continued to deny any knowledge of the attacks and claimed that their operatives had been conducting legitimate diplomatic activities. The captured equipment was transported to DARPA facilities for detailed technical analysis, providing American researchers with their first opportunity to examine the actual weapons being used in the attacks. The analysis revealed technology that was indeed several years ahead of anything in the American arsenal, confirming that the Russians had achieved significant breakthroughs in directed energy weapons research. Dr. Richardson's team spent 6 months reverse engineering the captured equipment and developing countermeasures based on detailed understanding of how the weapons actually function. The reverse engineering effort revealed that the weapons used a combination of microwave energy, focused electromagnetic pulses, and ultrasonic vibrations to create precisely targeted neurological effects. The multimodal approach explained why the attacks had been so difficult to defend against, and why the neurological damage had been so specific. By combining multiple types of energy, the weapons could target different types of brain tissue simultaneously and create interference patterns that were extremely difficult to detect or neutralize. Armed with detailed technical knowledge of the weapons, American researchers were finally able to develop effective countermeasures that could detect incoming attacks and generate defensive fields to protect personnel. The new countermeasures were deployed to American facilities worldwide in late 2023, and the frequency of successful attacks began to decline significantly. But the technological success was accompanied by a troubling realization about the scope and duration of the Russian attack program. Analysis of the captured equipment revealed manufacturing dates going back to 2014, suggesting that the Russians had been developing and testing these weapons for nearly a decade before deploying them operationally against American personnel. The timeline implied that the attacks weren't a response to any specific American action or policy, but rather part of a long-term strategic program to degrade American intelligence capabilities worldwide. The Russians had apparently decided that invisible attacks on American personnel were an effective way to achieve strategic objectives without triggering conventional military retaliation. Intelligence analysis of Russian communications intercepted during the investigation revealed that the attack program was overseen at the highest levels of the Russian government and was considered a major success by Russian leadership. The attacks had achieved their strategic objective of forcing the CIA to reduce operations in several key countries and had demonstrated Russian technological superiority in an important area of military research. The success of the Russian program was apparently inspiring other countries to develop similar capabilities, creating the proliferation crisis that American intelligence agencies were now facing. The technology was complex but not impossibly difficult to replicate once the basic principles were understood, and several countries had the technical expertise and resources to develop their own versions of the weapons. By early 2024, American countermeasures had significantly reduced the effectiveness of the original Russian weapons, but new attacks were being reported that appeared to involve different technology developed by other countries. The invisible war was evolving into a multilateral conflict with multiple adversaries using different variations of directed energy weapons. The psychological and operational impact of the attacks had already caused lasting damage to American intelligence capabilities. Hundreds of experienced intelligence officers had been forced to retire or accept reduced responsibilities due to neurological damage, and recruitment of new personnel was being affected by concerns about the invisible threat. Dr. Foster's long-term medical studies revealed that many attack victims were experiencing progressive neurological deterioration, even years after their initial exposure, suggesting that the weapons were causing damage that continued to worsen over time. The discovery meant that the ultimate cost of the attacks would be much higher than initially estimated, as victims might require lifetime medical care for conditions that would gradually destroy their cognitive abilities. The medical implications were particularly troubling because they suggested that the weapons were designed not just to incapacitate personnel temporarily, but to cause progressive brain damage that would worsen over time. The delayed effects meant that even personnel who appeared to recover from attacks might eventually develop severe disabilities that would prevent them from continuing their careers or living normal lives. Intelligence analysts studying the global pattern of attacks concluded that the invisible war represented a fundamental shift in the nature of international conflict, with adversaries using sophisticated technology to target individual personnel rather than engaging in conventional military confrontations. The approach allowed countries to achieve strategic objectives while maintaining plausible deniability and avoiding the diplomatic consequences of more direct attacks. The Biden administration's response to the confirmed Russian involvement included economic sanctions against Russian officials believed to be involved in the weapons program, expulsion of Russian diplomats suspected of conducting attacks, and acceleration of American research into both defensive and offensive directed energy weapons. But the diplomatic responses were limited by the need to avoid escalating the conflict into a more direct confrontation that could have unpredictable consequences. The attacks were causing real damage to American interests, but they weren't severe enough to justify military retaliation, and the invisible nature of the weapons made it difficult to develop effective deterrent threats. The technological competition between American defensive measures and adversaries' evolving weapons continued throughout 2024, with both sides achieving periodic advantages that were quickly countered by developments on the other side. The competition was driving rapid advances in directed energy technology that had implications far beyond the intelligence community. Military planners began incorporating directed energy weapons into broader strategic planning, recognizing that the technology could potentially be scaled up for use against military targets or civilian infrastructure. The weapons that were being used against individual intelligence officers could theoretically be modified to attack aircraft, ships, or even satellites, creating new categories of warfare that existing treaties and international law didn't address. As of late 2024, the invisible war continues, with no clear resolution in sight. American countermeasures have reduced the frequency and severity of attacks against U.S. personnel, but they haven't eliminated the threat entirely, and new variants of the weapons continue to appear as adversaries adapt their technology to circumvent American defenses. The long-term implications of Havana syndrome. extend far beyond the immediate threat to American intelligence personnel. The attacks have demonstrated that sophisticated adversaries can use advanced technology to wage invisible wars that cause real damage, while avoiding conventional retaliation. The precedent suggests that similar attacks could potentially be used against any country's personnel anywhere in the world. Dr. Foster, who has now spent over 7 years studying the attacks, believes that Havana syndrome represents the beginning of a new era in international conflict, where the boundaries between peace and war become increasingly blurred. We're looking at weapons that can cause military-level damage while maintaining the appearance of plausible deniability, she reports. This technology has the potential to fundamentally change how countries interact with each other. The invisible war has also highlighted the vulnerability of human cognitive abilities to technological attack, and the difficulty of defending against weapons that target the brain directly. The attacks have shown that even the most sophisticated security measures may be inadequate to protect against adversaries who have developed advanced neurotechnology. For the intelligence officers who have been affected by the attacks, Havana syndrome has meant the end of careers, permanent disability, and ongoing uncertainty about their long-term health prospects. Many victims continue to experience cognitive problems years after their initial exposure, and the progressive nature of the neurological damage means that their conditions may continue to worsen over time. Sarah Chen, the CIA operative who was among the first victims in Cuba, now requires ongoing medical care for memory problems and motor coordination issues that have made it impossible for her to work in any capacity that requires complex cognitive functions. "I gave my career to serving my country," Sarah says, "and my country's enemies took away my ability to think clearly. That's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." The personal cost of the invisible war is measured not just in the careers that have been destroyed, but in the families that have been affected by the long-term consequences of neurological damage. Spouses and children of attack victims have had to adapt to living with family members whose personalities and capabilities have been permanently altered by exposure to weapons that most people don't even know exist. The Havana syndrome crisis has also revealed the limitations of current international law and diplomatic mechanisms for addressing new forms of warfare that don't fit traditional categories of military action. The attacks exist in a gray zone between espionage and warfare, causing real damage while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid triggering established response mechanisms. As the invisible war continues, American intelligence agencies are being forced to develop new operational procedures, recruitment standards, and medical protocols to deal with an ongoing threat that may never be completely eliminated. The attacks have become a permanent feature of the threat environment that intelligence personnel must learn to live with and work around. The technology that was first used against American personnel in Cuba in 2016 has now spread to multiple countries and is being continuously refined and improved by adversaries who recognize its strategic value. The invisible war that began in Havana has become a global conflict with no clear end in sight, fought with weapons that most people can't see and defended against with countermeasures that may always be one step behind the attackers. What makes this whole situation even more terrifying is that right now, as you're watching this video, there are probably American intelligence officers somewhere in the world who are being targeted by these invisible weapons. There are people whose job it is to protect our national security, and they're being systematically attacked by enemies who can strike without warning, cause permanent brain damage, and disappear without leaving any evidence that they were ever there. This isn't ancient history, or some theoretical threat that might happen someday. This is happening right now. It's been going on for 8 years, and our government still doesn't have a complete solution to the problem. Every day that goes by, more American personnel are at risk of having their brains permanently damaged by an enemy that we can't see, and weapons that we're still struggling to understand. If you found this story as absolutely mind-blowing and terrifying as I did when I first learned about it, Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because this is exactly the kind of real, ongoing mystery that most people never hear about, but that could literally change the course of world history. We've got tons more incredible true stories about government cover-ups, invisible threats, and the secret wars that are being fought right under our noses every single day. Drop a comment below if you think the government is telling us the truth about Havana Syndrome, or if you believe there's even more to this story that we haven't been told yet, and let me know what other classified mysteries you want us to investigate next.